All right, welcome everyone. You are tuning in to the Center on Democracy, Development, and the Rule of Law's weekly seminar series. We hope you're all doing well, and I can't believe that the election is happening very soon. The Thursday after the election, on November 5th, this regular seminar series will be a panel discussion on the outcome, if we have one, and the issues surrounding the election. So we hope to see you then. But today we are very excited to have our speaker, Nate Grubman, who is one of the postdoctoral fellows at CDDRL this year. In this past fall, he received his PhD from Yale University in political science, and his research focuses on political nostalgia, ideology, corruption, and authoritarian legacies in new democracies. Today, he's going to be speaking about his dissertation research on Tunisia. So without further ado, Nate, take it away. And if you have any questions, please go ahead and enter them into the Q&A box, and we'll be sure to leave plenty of time for discussion. All right,
okay,
Nate.
Thank you, Didi, and thank you to CDDRL for offering me this opportunity to present my research, and also for scheduling it during prime time in Tunisia. So I think some of the people who have helped me out the most with this research are able to participate, and I really appreciate that. This talk is going to focus on the 2019 elections in Tunisia, which I argue have some broader implications for the development of party systems. Okay. All right. The motivation for the talk is that the party system in Tunisia in the early years of this political transition, parties have distinguished themselves from each other primarily in reference to this conflict between Islamism and secularism, rather than according to competing economic policy orientations. And that's an observation that's been problematized by scholars, in part because Tunisians seem mainly concerned with economic issues, and also because Tunisia, the life has become more difficult since the revolution. And here on the right side of this, or on the right side of this slide, if you're looking at it, there's a picture I took of a stencil from a social movement in Tunisia called Fashionista, which means what are we waiting for? And this movement was formed in protest to the finance law in 2018, and in part signals a frustration among many citizens with the economic policy choices of the government. And so there's been this growing perception that life has become more difficult since the revolution. And if we turn towards the 2019 elections, I think we see manifestations of that in a number of different ways. One is, as may or may not be surprising, there is some nostalgia for the former regime. So if you look at the figure on the right side of the slide, what we did in the survey is we asked participants to evaluate prominent integrity and their level of competence. And the red line signifies the mean level of integrity for the former, perceived integrity for the former dictator Ben Ali, and also his perceived competence on top. And what's significant about this is that he seems to be perceived as being kind of average in terms of the level of corruption, which is interesting for someone who was chased from the country and called, the head of his family was referred to as a band of thieves. And he's perceived as being more competent than most of the prominent politicians in the country. So that signals that there might be some political manifestation of the kind of growing sense that things have gotten worse since the revolution. But at the same time, we see other sorts of kind of bold alternatives to the status quo also enjoy some traction. So on the left is a poster for the person who would be elected president. He won approximately 75 or almost 75% of the vote in the runoff election. And his slogan is Ashaburid, which is a slogan that comes from the revolution in 2010, 2011. It means the people want. So what I'm trying to illustrate here is that there's this party system that has kind of revolved around this Islamist secularist conflict. There's clearly a lot of concern with economic issues coinciding with it. And there seems to be support for these kind of bold alternatives to the status quo. And so I'm going to kind of study the relationship between those three things. I think that these observations raise some general questions that are central to comparative politics. One is, how do the perceptions of deterioration or nostalgia, I'm going to kind of use those terms synonymously, that often accompany political transitions shape the appeals made by political parties in these systems and the political cleavages on which they lie? And two, how should we understand support for unorthodox political movements in new democracies? The outline for this talk, I'm first going to talk about the theoretical relationship between perceptions of deterioration and party system change. I'm then going to talk about insiders and outsiders and how to think of them in regards to Tunisia's 2019 election. I'm then going to describe and share the results of a survey that I conducted in October 2019, immediately following the elections, and specifically focus on measurements of nostalgia in Tunisia. And then I'm going to discuss manifestations of nostalgia in political behavior, and then finally move to the part of the presentation that I'm most excited about, which is kind of discussion, conclusions, and then fielding questions from the audience. All right, so how are perceptions of deterioration in everyday life potentially related to the cleavages on which political party systems lie, particularly in countries in which they might lie on kind of secularist religious cleavages? So I would argue that the first approaches focus on the sort of political platforms, the stances that are adopted by political parties in response to this growing sense that things have gotten worse. So first, there's what I call the default. And this is the idea that perceptions of deterioration will precipitate a party system organized around an economic left and right. Now, this could be partially just because of the effect of time. The literature on political transitions has recognized that it takes time for elites to kind of sort into political parties with distinct policy stances. And then it also takes time for voters to learn about the differences between the parties. But it also could be due to the sense that things have gotten worse in terms of the economy and daily life, could encourage voters to put more, to have a stronger interest in economic policy platforms. The second approach that I think focuses on the policy stances that are taken by parties argues that I call this the values first approach, argues that widespread perceptions of deterioration will only strengthen values-based appeals, at least on the right. And so basically, for some of the same reasons discussed in regards to the default model, we might expect that parties on the right would try to distract the poor by really emphasizing conservative social values. This may be particularly appealing to them because experiences of hardship they might make voters kind of more attuned to policy platforms, but they also have an emotional component in that they might provoke fear, anger, pessimism, emotions that might provide some of the existential motives for social cognition. They might make people adhere more closely to kind of conservative social values. And there's some experimental evidence in Tunisia that argues that this is the case in the lab in Tunisia. Economic strain, experiences of economic strain have been found to increase support for political Islam in the lab in Tunisia. Apart from these models that emphasize kind of the programmatic responses of political parties to widespread difficulties in daily life, I also want to focus on a couple of retrospective voting models. The first one holds that in new democracies, voters are often going to take kind of the beginning of the transition as a reference point, according to which to compare how well they're doing today. And that those who are happy with how they're doing today will be likely to support new regime parties, so parties that have participated in governing during the transition. And those who are unhappy with how things are going are likely to support outsiders, old regime parties. And so this is the argument offered by Joshua Tucker in regards to the post-communist countries. And I think the interesting thing about it is that it implies that there's going to be this consolidation of the party system around this conflict between the old regime and the new regime. An alternative, however, is offered by Populisms, also in regards to the post-communist countries, but he argues that that indeed those who are happy with how things are going during the transition are likely to reward those who have governed during the transition. That could be parties who have emerged during the new regime, but it also could be former regime parties who then compete in elections in the new regime and then participate in government. But critically, those who are upset with how things are going, he finds that they're likely to support a number of different, he calls it unorthodox alternatives. I think maybe if the article were written today, maybe it would emphasize populism a little bit more, but unorthodox alternatives to the status quo, the parties that just seem very different from those that have governed. In my argument regarding what has happened in Tunisia, especially in the 2019 elections, is similar to this, in that I argued that these perceptions of economic and security-related deterioration have been associated with aversion to parties that have participated in government during the transition and with support for political movements seen as being the most unlike them. And critically, it is difficult to predict the contents of those parties' appeals that are most unlike the status quo parties. In Tunisia, I argue that there are three main mechanisms that outsider movements have used to distinguish themselves from the political class. These are promises of dramatic institutional change and demonstration of conflict with governing elites. And so these are three aspects that I'm going to focus on very briefly in this short presentation, but would love to discuss further in the questions. All right, so turning to Tunisian politics, the 2019 elections. I know that the audience probably has a different level of exposure to Tunisia and knowledge of Tunisia. A lot of political scientists are working on Tunisia these days. These elections were held in September and October 2019. They were the third national elections of this political transition. Like the previous elections, they offered almost a staggering amount of choice to citizens. So on the right, this is a sample ballot from one of the states in Tunisia. It wasn't randomly selected. This is the one with the most number of lists, as I recall. But so there were 1,500 electoral lists in 33 different districts in the country. In presidential elections, there were 26 different candidates in the first round. And critically, these elections took place after the legislature passed a June amendment, so several months before the elections, to the electoral law that was designed to raise the threshold by which parties had to meet to go to the legislature, that banned those from running who did not have a clean legal record or who had benefited in the past year from a charitable association or television station, that banned those from running who glorified dictatorship. And so this is something that I'm going to be referencing later in the presentation, but this was perceived as targeting some of the main outsider movements. It was passed by the legislature, but the president refused to make a decision on it and actually died shortly thereafter. Okay, so there's a lot of different elements of the elections that we could focus on, but this talk is focused on insiders and outsiders. And so the first trend that I want to point to is the decline of parties that have governed at any point during the transition. So on the right, or on the slides left, I keep wanting to say that, but on the right, as you look at it, the blue line is Ennahda, and that's the main Islamist party. So they did very well in the 2011 elections and governed along with a couple other parties, then declined pretty dramatically for the 2014 elections. and then declined again in 2019. Nidea Tunis, the kind of secularist alternative that emerged to balance the party system and oppose the Nahda, won the 2014 elections, but decided to govern along with Ennahda, and the two parties together experienced a very dramatic decline in the 2019 elections. So if kind of the established governing parties have declined, who are the outsiders? There are lots of different outsider movements that I could talk about today and that I would like to talk about today, but can't for the sake of time. So I'm just going to focus on a few. The first is the movement of independence, and the kind of main figure exemplifying, or perhaps you could say leading this movement, is Qais Said, the person who would be elected president in these elections. So a big part of his appeal is that he is anti-political party and anti the political parties that have governed, both rhetorically and in terms of his performance. Rhetorically, in the sense that he says that the political parties in Tunisia have aborted the revolution, that political parties are outmoded, outdated institutions anyways, and excuse me, trying to go back. Okay, so he has this criticism of political parties for kind of getting in the way of people's ability to kind of achieve their interests through democracy, but he also kind of performs as an anti-partisan. He refuses to form a political party of his own, despite the fact that he's very popular. He doesn't really campaign in the presidential elections, doesn't really appear before the media, especially before the first round. He claims that he never voted before the transition, that he never voted during the transition, and that he wouldn't even vote for himself in the election. So this is a demonstration of kind of being an anti-politician, an anti-partisan, and I would argue it's a big part of his appeal. Now, part of that is also being anti-programmatic. So although he does kind of communicate some policy preferences, he emphasizes that he is not going to propose policies, and that instead what he's offering is he's offering the prospect of changes to the institutions that will allow Tunisians to kind of achieve their own goals at the local level. So he, one thing that he often repeats in interviews is the people want and they know what they want. And this is the idea that people should be able to decide at the local level what their kind of projects and policies will be. He promises pretty dramatic institutional change, a constitutional amendment to recenter power at the local level. And unlike some of the other politicians that will come, he doesn't really have the same sort of claim to victimhood by the political elite. And in the interest of time, I'm going to sort of skip this part of the discussion, but I just want to point out that there are a number of movements that are claiming to be independent and anti-partisan. And so this is a candidate for political office who's wearing a shirt that says, "Don't be afraid, we are not a political party." Okay, so then on to sort of the second movement that I want to talk about. And this is the one led by Nabil Qarawi. And there's the screenshot of him appearing at a press conference, and sort of the takeaway from it is him saying, it would be an honor for us to be a Macaroni party. Now, and the idea there is that Qarawi really emerges as a political figure, becomes stronger as a political figure, starting in 2016 or 2017, when he forms a charitable association, starts to travel the country. He's a wealthy media magnate. He starts to travel the country and give people basically food and basic goods. And his private television station covers these charitable acts. And so people start calling him Nabil Macaroni. That's a name that he eventually kind of embraces. He, unlike Syed, he is not anti-party. He forms his own political party. He's not as anti-programmatic like a lot of the other political parties in Tunisia during the transition. He emphasizes that he has sort of assembled a team, that he's gone to the people to discuss their problems, and then he's assembled this team of experts who have found the best solution. He is also not really proposing dramatic institutional changes, but sort of alluding to his ability to help people to kind of get around the system. But I would argue that the main part of his appeal as an outsider is this claim to victimhood by the political elite. So he points to the fact that the government shut down his television station, that the legislature passed a law that was designed to exclude him, and then that he was actually imprisoned for tax evasion and corruption shortly before the elections. Now we can debate, the merits of each of these moves, but this is part of his claim that he's an outsider, and the evidence of that is that the insiders have it out for him. Okay, and then the last outsider movement that I want to talk about here is that of Abir Musi. This is the Free Historian Party. And this is one of her kind of often used, which is responsible democracy. And she's proposing a project of a new constitution that breaks with the fragmentation of decision and establishing a strong and just state. So she is anti-party in the sense that she promises to end the rule of parties, so end partisan pluralism. She's not anti-programmatic. She does release a party platform and discusses it in similar ways as does Karawi. She is promising institutional change, but in a very different direction from Syed. She's promising to centralize rather than decentralize. She also has this claim to victimhood by the political elite. She's clearly in a very strong conflict with Ennahda, who she refers to as the Islamic State, Muslim Brotherhood, merchants of chaos, these very pejorative terms. Okay, so how can we study the association between the decline of these insider parties and the rise of these outsider parties? Well, I do so in part through a survey that I conducted in Tunisia in October 2019. It started the day after the elections and ran for, I think, 17 days, as I recall. An N of 1,200 approximately in person using tablets. It was designed in collaboration with Milan Svolik, and it was conducted by Elka Consulting. Critically for this talk, it includes measures of perceptions of change since the revolution in multiple ways, which I will identify as personal, sociotropic, and fact-based. It features questions regarding voting behavior as well as evaluations of competence and integrity of prominent politicians. And it offers primarily correlational rather than causal evidence. So that's something that we should keep in mind and we should be thinking about throughout this talk. So the first form of measurement, and I should say first that I'm using these terms nostalgia and perceptions of deterioration synonymously, and that's partially due to how I'm measuring both of them, in the sense that I'm treating nostalgia as a measurement of how much one thinks that things have gotten worse. Now, this could be informed by, informed by sentimentality, excessive sentimentality, the things that we often associate with nostalgia, or it could be actually just an objective perception of what's happened. So first, if we focus on personal nostalgia, if we ask people, would you say that you were better off financially than before the revolution? Would you say that you're safer or less safe than before the revolution? A large percentage of respondents said that they were worse off than before the revolution and that they felt less safe. So there's this personal sense among a lot of people that things have become more difficult for them personally. There also is evidence of sociotropic nostalgia. So nostalgia regarding the state of society and of the country itself, rather than just oneself. If we focus on kind of material issues. So if we ask about unemployment, a vast majority of people think that it's gotten much worse since the revolution. If we ask about corruption in government, a vast majority think that it's gotten much worse since the revolution. Security, this finding is interesting, and I actually find it quite puzzling because unlike the finding regarding personal nostalgia, a lot of people actually seem to think that things have gotten better. for the country in terms of security. And then there's these questions about political freedoms and freedom to practice religion. And and here we see a lot of people expressing the notion that things have gotten better, though perhaps maybe not quite as high as we might expect. So then we included questions regarding fact-based nostalgia. And so we're trying to kind of drain the excessive sentimentality here, ask people questions about facts. What was the price of a liter of gasoline before the revolution? What is it today? What was the official rate of unemployment in 2018? What was it before the revolution? How many violent crimes took place in Tunisia in 2018? How many took place in 2010? And so I should note that there are lots of similar questions that we could have asked about maybe political issues. How many political prisoners were there? We could ask about kind of cultural issues. How many films were produced in Tunisia in 2019 versus 2010? And we might get very different answers. So it's important to remember that we're focusing on kind of these particular issues. What do we find? We find that with regards to here, these are histograms, the red, and I apologize actually if these colors are inaccessible, but the red refers to kind of the level of this perception before the revolution, and the green is today. And I should note that we gave people options, which I find in kind of testing out the survey questions made it easier for people to answer the survey. But anyways, people are pretty evenly distributed regarding what was the level of unemployment before the revolution. There's a lot of disagreement there. There's a lot of agreement that it's very high today. Regarding violent crimes, it's the opposite. People don't really, there's not a lot of agreement regarding the number of violent crimes committed in Tunisia in a given year. It's a very hard question. But there is this kind of consensus, or a lot of people feel that things were much better in that regard before the revolution. And then the price of a liter of gas is somewhat of a mixture of these two. People in general have a very accurate perception of what the price of a liter of gas is today, which I think at the time of the survey was 2.10. But many people remember the price of a liter of gas being even lower than it was before the revolution. Now, another critical part of the design is we wanted to distinguish between nostalgia as cheap talk, so people saying gas was free before the revolution, everything was great, and their actual sincerely held beliefs. And so what we did is we incentivized half of the respondents, randomly selected, to receive a small amount of phone credit, half a dinar per question, which could add up to 3 dinars, for correct answers to each of these questions. And what we find here is that people are not, it doesn't seem like people are giving us cheap talk in general. The distributions look very similar. So those who received phone credit answered the questions similarly to those who didn't. So what's the kind of relationship between nostalgia, or the correlation, I should say, between nostalgia and political behavior? This is sort of just like a kind of broad overview figure that separates people's reported electoral behavior in the 2019 legislative elections by quintile, according to an index of nostalgia that I created using the fact-based questions. And what is striking here is that post-uprising governing parties do much worse among the nostalgic than they do among the non-nostalgic. And then that Qalb Tunis, Nabil Qarawiy's movement, or party, I should say, seems to do better among the nostalgic. Independents, it looks like they do a little bit better. And other older regime parties, mainly Abir Musi's party, also do better among the nostalgic. Those last three, and I should say that the first finding regarding governing parties is much stronger when regards to Ennahda, and less strong and somewhat model dependent regarding Nida Tunis. And the support for outsider parties also depends somewhat on the controls that are included in the regressions and which nostalgia measure is used. If we move towards attitudes of politicians who have participated in government, there's a similar finding. These are plots of regression coefficients of different measures of nostalgia, including controls. These are OLS regressions, so they're just designed to kind of measure the strength of a correlation. And we see that politicians who participated in government are evaluated more harshly on a scale of 0 to 10 by those who are nostalgic, especially members of Ennahda, also members of the Troika, those who governed with Ennahda are evaluated much more harshly. Nidea Tunis, there's not much of a relationship here, at least for the politicians that we included in this survey. Okay, moving on to the outsider politicians. So we see Nabil Karoui and Abir Musi. There seems to generally be a positive correlation between nostalgia and one's evaluation of the competence of these two figures. But Qais Said, although those who report voting for an independent list are slightly more nostalgic than those who do not, Qais Said is actually supported more by those who are feeling less nostalgic, who think that things have gone well since the revolution. So that contradicts the earlier findings slightly. Okay, so moving on, and that's kind of just the, I don't want to say tip of the iceberg, but that's just an overview of the findings. But because I'm interested in moving on to the questions, I just want to raise like some discussion questions that are kind of in my head. One is, what about contingencies? This is a case in which you had two parties on opposite ends of this kind of ideological conflict who then governed together. So what might have happened if they hadn't done so? Would those who are frustrated with how things are today then have voted for Ennahda? I find it's very hard to say. What would have happened if that failed electoral law reform hadn't failed? Again, very difficult to say. Two other questions. Why anti-partisanship as a rallying cry? Is this a legacy of authoritarian rule and weak parties? And then this question of whether this is a late transition phenomenon or a general theory. So we could see Ennahda's success in 2011 as a function of it being the clearest alternative to Ben Ali and his regime, in the sense that it was kind of the public enemy #1. And then in 2014, Nidea had been labeled by Ennahda as more dangerous than the Salafis, as kind of its main foil. And so perhaps, that's where its appeal lies. So I'm eager to get to the questions, but in conclusion, nostalgia is very widespread in post-uprising Tunisia. It is not just cheap talk, but seems to reflect sincerely held beliefs. And it seems to underlie a turn away from the parties that have governed during the transition and toward anti-system outsiders, although we should be careful of causal claims in this regard. It makes party system consolidation very challenging. And I think it's also worth concluding that the heterogeneity of outsider status suggests an unpredictability to political cleavages and party systems in new democracies. And so that's all that I have for the talk. I'm very looking forward to hearing the questions. Thanks again for this opportunity to present.
Excellent. Thanks so much for that talk, Nate. And you can also stop screen sharing if that's easier. I'm not sure if people might ask you to go back to some slides, but that'll just make it easier for the audience to sort of follow our discussion. So the first question from Marcel Fafchamp is, how do perceptions and the questions that you ask compare to actual figures? Like, what are the actual material circumstances in Tunisia today compared to before the revolution?
Okay, so that's a question that I'm working on, in the sense that I think that the most kind of appealing way to answer it would be to study electoral reform or electoral returns and how they correlate. There are problems of ecological inference, but that's kind of a path that I'm going down right now. In terms of the within the survey itself, there doesn't actually seem to be a positive correlation between nostalgia and living in a state in which unemployment has increased since the revolution. So there doesn't seem to be a terribly strong positive correlation between these perceptions and that admittedly very macro level observation.
So you're saying that there might be some people who are worse off than before, but there's not a relationship between nostalgia and being worse off.
Yes, especially if we talk about there being, so there's not a correlation between being nostalgic and living in a state in which things have seemingly gotten better in terms of unemployment. So these still could be people who are experiencing greater difficulties than the rest of their citizens. I do see, those who there's a positive correlation between nostalgia and reporting a low level of income, reporting that one falls at a lower rung on the wealth distribution in the country. There's a correlation between being nostalgic and not having the primary breadwinner in your family not having a labor contract. So labor market outsiders express greater nostalgia in this survey. But again, something that I'm hoping to do this year is explore this question in regards to election returns as well.
Okay, so this is a sort of follow-up to that. Lisa Blades is asking, first, she says, thank you for a very interesting talk. And can you say more about the demographic determinants of authoritarian nostalgia? In Iraq, there's evidence that young Iraqis may have an idealized perspective regarding Ba'athist rule. So is this the case in Tunisia as well? Like, might this be emblematic of a general trend?
So as I recall, actually, it's the opposite in this survey, that older respondents are more likely to express nostalgia. I think that it might depend on which measure of nostalgia. I don't think that that's totally robust of the three measures, but it seems to be the opposite relationship here. So that's quite interesting.
That is interesting. And another question is, can you say more about correlates such as level of education? You started to say something about the material circumstances, like a labor contract, but any more about religion, gender, or education level?
Okay, education level, definitely respondents who report a lower level of education report higher levels of nostalgia. As I recall, in all three measures. I had a slide on this and then I took it out to condense the presentation. There wasn't gender didn't, as I recall, there wasn't a correlation with gender or religiosity as we measure it. We measure it by asking people about the frequency of various religious practices. So yes, as I recall, there wasn't a correlation in that regard.
Interesting. Okay, so another question from Frank Fukuyama is that other possible explanations for nostalgia might include the old regime's ability to suppress bad news versus more openness today, or expectations just rising much faster under democracy rather than can realistically happen. So what do you think of those possible alternatives?
So yeah, I mean, I think that both of them are plausible, and I have trouble distinguishing between the two. There's been a lot of scholarship on both the Ben Ali regime's claim to have achieved an economic miracle, and also to have suppressed kind of discussion about difficult economic issues in the media. And there's also been some research on the fact that Tunisia's economy started to struggle before the revolution began. Tunisia's economy is somewhat linked to that of Europe, so the financial crisis was very difficult for Tunisia, but that's something that doesn't seem to be kind of front of mind. In terms of the expectations argument, I think that there's a lot of merit to that, and I think that part of the turn against partisanship and the turn against party platforms in particular has to do with the promises that were made by the parties early in the transition. So some of the parties were sort of arguing that democracy is the solution, and it's the solution to unemployment, to various economic issues. And so they were kind of pledging positive results in that regard. But at the same time, there were also parties that published extremely technical, kind of expert-led party platforms that ran the figures and that concluded that growth would be astronomical if they were elected. So Ennahda, famously, politicians often refer to the fact that Ennahda promised to create hundreds of thousands of jobs in 2011, that Nideh Tunis also made quite expansive promises. It promised, I forget the figures, but particularly the level of investment that it promised is often ridiculed today. And those are kind of the empty promises that some of these kind of anti-programmatic politicians are responding to.
Okay. So this is a related question from Hisham Salam. There's a consensus among scholars of Tunisia that the post-Ben Ali political order was grounded in an agreement among the major political parties and actors not to move decisively on economic reform and put that question on the back burner. So they would basically agree to do nothing about an issue since they fundamentally disagree. To what extent does this impasse explain your outcome of interest, that social support for populism and outsiders is sort of the only way that voters are given a choice?
Well, yeah, thank you. I think that's, yeah, so my dissertation research was kind of motivated by seeing these in the beginning, I was interested in understanding how are parties responding to these obviously widespread demands for kind of different economic policy. And so I became interested in how can we actually describe the party system in terms of parties on the left and parties on the right. And I read the party platforms, I conducted computer-assisted text analysis, I've studied all these kind of correlates in terms of party preferences and partisanship. And sort of my conclusion, and also I've interviewed many of those who were involved in writing the platforms for the various parties. And I think that there is, those kind of different methods of inquiry have all suggested that for the most part, outside of a few smaller parties, the party system has it has not offered a wide range of choices in terms of responding to economic issues. And so in my reading, that does seem to be contributing to what has followed.
Okay, so as a follow-on to that, do you think it's possible that there's, I mean, I guess we'll call it an endogeneity problem, whereby parties' actual failure to provide a response to grievances held by citizens is the reason that nostalgia has grown? In other words, is it possible that nostalgia is a rational response to a lack of contestation in the party system?
So is it a rational response? Yeah, I mean, especially how it's measured in this survey. It's these questions, again, I've been using the term nostalgia, but kind of using it synonymously with perceptions of deterioration. So the sense that that things have gotten worse in some ways, and for a lot of people is true. So in that sense, it does seem to be rational. In terms of I think the question also relates to, is the support for these really kind of bold alternatives to the status quo, is that a rational way, or will that be effective in getting the party system to offer kind of more appealing alternatives? And I think that this is sort of a weak answer. It's hard to say. One problem with it is that apart from the presidential election where Kais Saied won a very significant mandate, the legislative elections produced a legislature. I think the effective number of parties in the legislature was something like 8 or something like that, out of 217 seats. The government formation process lasted something like 4 months. and ended up producing a government that only lasted a couple months, a few months after that. And so in terms of actually producing a political movement that eventually kind of produces policies, I think that kind of the fragmentation of the different alternatives has perhaps hindered that.
Okay. So a question from Salma Musa. In the absence, perhaps, of clear demographic correlates of nostalgia, are there personality traits that are maybe associated with nostalgia? So in particular, the literature on authoritarian disposition tells us there might be some psychological determinants of nostalgia. What do you think?
Yeah, it's a great question. And it's something that we wanted to include in this survey, but ultimately ended up taking out an interest of space. But I think that's, a really promising question, could be studied, by somebody else kind of using a similar research design and should be.
Okay, so a question from Brett Carter. There are a few sort of related questions having to do with the political implications of nostalgia. First, is there evidence that the nostalgic engage in collective action at higher rates than otherwise? And second, are the nostalgic perhaps more likely to trade civil liberties for a would-be autocrat than they would be to make things better? And more broadly, can we think of nostalgia as threatening a democratic transition process through a protest effect or through an electoral effect?
Okay. All right. So on the first question of nostalgia and whether it causes collective action, we can't speak to participation in protests, but one thing we can speak to is participation in the elections themselves, which is maybe not necessarily collective action, but communicates some sense of efficacy or motivation. And there is not a statistically significant difference in the level of participation among the nostalgic and the non-nostalgic. So it doesn't seem to, there are some people who are very nostalgic and who are not participating, and there are some who are participating. The question of civil liberties is, I think, really important. And I think it's certainly, I think it's troubling to see political movements that are, using some of the slogans of the old regime, that are making references to getting rid of chaos. Some of the implicit promises there, I think, were anti-civil liberties. This is something that this is part of my collaboration with Milan Svolik, but one thing we're doing is we're studying whether people, we also had a conjoint experiment in the survey where we gave people choices among politicians who vary according to platforms that are more or less democratic, as well as more or less Islamist, more or less leftist or liberal. And so it's something that we are studying, but I'm not quite, we haven't gotten to the results quite yet.
Okay.
Oh, sorry.
Oh, go ahead.
The last question, actually, I probably should have just let you go because I'm a little bit unclear on the distinction between protest effects and election effects.
Well, let's, I think, push on that a little bit more when we think about generalizability. So is it common in transitioning countries for there to be this kind of effect of people being upset because of performance legitimacy questions, or because of failures of the immediate post-transition regime to enact enough political change? Do you find that this nostalgia or anti-partism is common in other transitioning democracies? And if so, how does it bode for the sort of long-term prospects of the transition?
Okay, so that's a good question. I think that's another thing where I really wanted to kind of put Tunisia into a broader context in this talk, but kind of felt a little short on time. But so if we, first of all, I think it's important to recognize that the sorts of difficulties experienced by Tunisia in terms of insecurity, especially kind of this threat of regional insecurity, in terms of economic stagnation, are higher than in some other, in transitions in other parts of the world. But in terms of some of the economic difficulties are maybe not quite as great as some of the Eastern European transitions, for example, in terms of the level of growth. So that I think that's something that I want to look at more in terms of where Tunisia fits compared to other political transitions. I think kind of the message of this talk, I mean, it does seem like although nostalgia for the old regime is not the only thing that would cause people to vote for authoritarian successor parties or for populist parties, it does seem like a general enough phenomenon that it's become, you know, a major area of study in recent years. But I would have to do a little bit more reading in terms of, you know, similar studies that have been done in other countries and kind of what's different about our findings and what's different there.
Okay. Another question that I had is about party building, traditional party building. So you cite Tabbits, and you know, there's so many people who have done work on how parties start to mobilize a constituency over time. It takes a long time. And also we know that there's a whole international sort of democracy promotion infrastructure that typically helps with establishing newer parties and emerging democracies, although it has, you know, been in decline, that industry, over the past few decades. But my question is, how have the parties in post-transition Tunisia relied on any kind of traditional party building at the grassroots level? And how has that interacted with the development of anti-partism and I guess what we could call populism?
Okay, so I think it really varies by political party. So Ennahda has been able to establish offices throughout the country. If you go to those offices, there are people working at those offices. There are constituency services happening at those offices. Ennahda maintains that its funding comes from party members paying dues, although its opponents allege that that's not true. But it really does vary by political party. But in general, I would say that it's quite common with many of the political parties. If you ask even like fairly high level leaders, especially leaders who are working on political platforms and things like that, there's often a hesitancy or a distancing that happens in terms of traditional membership. So if you ask somebody, are you a member? And you use the term for like, do you have a card? Are you munkhart? They often say, no, I'm not a member of the party. I'm just an independent citizen who's just trying to help out. But yeah, I guess the answer is that it does vary, but that most of the kind of models of political party building in Tunisia have not been based on this model of kind of card-carrying members who are paying dues and primary elections, although some of the parties have talked about establishing those. Ennahda is kind of an exception in that it has a more traditional model.
Okay, so I'm going to combine questions here from Richard Theo and Jake Grubman, perhaps a relation, to ask about some lessons for the West. So first, could you comment on the parallels between your theoretical framework's discussion of values orientation in new democracies with what's happening in the United States and the emphasis on values that political leaders invoke, especially on the right? And also, there is a question, about the political season here in the United States. Do you have any lessons or extrapolations from your research that can inform what's happening in older democracies as well?
So Jake Grubman is my brother. So it's great that we're able to do this virtually because he's very far away. In terms of lessons for US politics, I mean, it's quite striking that in this very seminar, we had a session, what was it, 2 sessions ago, that was focused on kind of the public policy differences between Biden and Trump. And a lot of the conclusion was that they're not really playing much of a role in the election. So I think the question is, like, what can we learn from Tunisia that might be informing what is happening here in that regard? And I could speculate about kind of the role of the role of social media, the fact that policy has become more kind of technical in recent years and perhaps indistinguishable, and but I don't have a real kind of strong takeaway there.
I'll ask you a more sort of academic version of that question then. Do you think that when party systems lack an economic or material cleavage, when they are not distinguished on economic policy per se, do you think that anti-partism and the nostalgia that you describe is pretty much always the consequence or one of the most likely responses to that? Because there's a lot of scholarship showing that in the advanced liberal democracies since the 1990s, parties of the left and right have converged on economic policy as well. And the removal of that contestation has very much produced more values and symbolic types of issues in campaigns. So do you think that this is perhaps a pattern that is true when you don't have contestation on economic grounds?
I mean, it seems like there is research in other regions that would perhaps support. I mean, yeah, you could run a very similar study in the U.S., and I'm sure people are, where you ask people, how they remember the Obama administration,
right.
The kind of before the political transition. Unfortunately, I don't have I mean, my inclination is that yes, there is that relationship, but I'm kind of struggling to tease out the mechanism.
Okay, well, that is a lot of fun future work for lots of people to do, including you and me and many others who are interested in parties in both emerging and advanced democracies. So thank you everyone for tuning in. That wraps us up for today. Nate, best of luck with this research. It was really fascinating. And thank you everyone for joining us.
Thank you.